I just want to take this time to welcome you all to today's panel discussion. What's Mine is Mine, Self-Plagiarism, Ownership, and Author Responsibility. My name is Jason Chu. I'm with Turnitin, and I will be your moderator today. And I'm very pleased to introduce you to our presenters. First off, we have Kelly McBride. She's in that top video feed there. Kelly is a senior faculty member at the Poynter Institute. And the Poynter Institute, just quickly, is a school dedicated to teaching and inspiring journalists and media leaders. It promotes excellence and integrity in journalism. Welcome, Kelly.
Thanks for having me.
And next we have Rachel Lammy. Rachel is a project manager for Crossref. She's in that bottom video feed you see there. And Crossref is a not-for-profit membership association of publishers established to help publishers prevent plagiarism. And they are also partners of ours on the Crosscheck service. Welcome, Rachel.
Hi, good evening.
And last but not least, we have Jonathan Bailey, author and consultant, principal of Plagiarism Today and Copybyte. Plagiarism Today is a site that addresses plagiarism and copyright issues. He works actively in writing to increase awareness of the prevalence of plagiarism in publishing and on the web. Welcome, Jonathan.
Glad to be here.
Well, let's do this first. Let's do a poll. We'd like to get our participants' perspective on whether or not plagiarism is a form of scholarly misconduct. So we definitely see a trend here with most of our folks coming in at a 3 or higher, and we can definitely address some of these results as we go through the presentation. So I'm going to start off with a question here. We have a couple of questions just to kind of provide us with a level set with respect to folks' perspectives on self-plagiarism. And to that end, our three panelists come with very different backgrounds. Kelly comes from a journalism and journalist background. Jonathan is an expert again on copyright issues, plagiarism also on the web. And we have Rachel, who comes to this question from the publishing side. So when and why is self-plagiarism considered a form of scholarly misconduct?
So scholarly misconduct, I think self-plagiarism is more often going to be a problem than in other types of writing. In a scholarly setting, your work is supposed to be original. In the setting that I work in, self-plagiarism is a form of misconduct when you have misled the audience, when you've been dishonest about whether this work is original or not. And you can do that explicitly, or you can do that implicitly. I think there are different ways of deceiving the audience. You know, I think the easiest way to not deceive the audience is to be absolutely transparent, to make sure that they know what they're reading. If it's a work that portion of it appeared somewhere else, if you tell people that that's the case, in most cases you're going to avoid any sort of misconduct or perception of misconduct in both the scholarly and in the popular publishing setting.
Thank you, Kelly. Rachel, how do you all look at self-plagiarism from the publishing perspective?
I think I'd agree with what Kelly said in that it's basically so it isn't misleading people. So I think again, as Kelly was saying, it's the intention to be clear about what you're presenting to your audience, what's being used elsewhere. It's maybe in different ways, and to make that apparent for people, rather than passing something off as new, which isn't.
And Jonathan, what's your take on all of this?
Well, I think a lot of it has to do with kind of the expectations of the audience, because there are environments where self-plagiarism is considered. When you're using something that you've done from earlier works and you're not attributing it correctly, then you're misleading the audience.
I've got a question here from the audience I want to pose to you all. Why would an author-researcher wish to mislead the public? What are some reasons? Is it to seem prolific?
We're kind of in a publish or perish environment right now. The universities, especially in the United States, I know, but also abroad and elsewhere, are very competitive about the grants and the research funds they want and desire. There's less of it to go around, and more researchers seeking it. And one of the ways to get more is, like you said, to appear more prolific. And it's an easy way to appear more prolific is to, take previous work and sort of recycle it and rehash it and publish it as something new.
Yeah, I think, one of the things that I see in journalism, and we saw this recently with the Jonah Lehrer case, is that there's a lot of pressure to publish for people who are writing for magazines or for scholarly journals. There's given the 24-hour news cycle now, where there's so much coming at such a high volume rate, there's a pressure to have your voice out there and to be part of the conversation. And so a lot of times I think writers are rehashing their work. In addition to that, I think there's sometimes a financial pressure to republish. You know, people get paid for their articles. And so rather than come up with something new, you know, they try and make as much money as they can off the same idea over and over again. And then finally, I think there's also sometimes I think writers are lazy, and rather than coming up with original thoughts, they rehash their old ideas, not because they're out of time, not because they need the money, but because they just don't want to bother coming up with fresh work, because it's hard work to write original thoughts all the time.
Absolutely, absolutely. And actually, I just want to touch back base before proceeding any more further here in the conversation by asking you all to kind of take a stab at defining what self-plagiarism is. The reason why I ask is that Carolyn asked a question about what is self-plagiarism, and given your different perspectives, you know, what is considered self-plagiarism? Rachel, what do you consider self-plagiarism in a publishing context?
In a publishing context, probably best thing is if I give an example. So if I get a paper submitted to a journal, and it's presented as a new paper, it doesn't reference previous works by that author, and then it comes through and I can hear, whenever it comes through, it looks like it's a new paper, it doesn't make any reference to previous papers. And then actually, say I check it through a plagiarism detection system, it comes up and actually there's quite a lot that's already been published by that author that contains similar work, similar paragraphs of text. Then I feel as someone working in the journal that actually what they're presenting to me isn't new information. So that's what I term self-plagiarism, either in terms of an oversight by the author in not referencing their previous work, or because they are deliberately omitting it in order to present their information as new and to appear more prolific.
Sure, sure. Thank you, Rachel. I think, Kelly, you addressed this a bit when you mentioned layer, which is namely, you know, I take it from you, from a journalist's perspective, that self-plagiarism is just namely repurposing content that someone's written before, an author's written before, except in a different context, correct?
Right, but it's the exact repurposing of it. It's the specific words and literally picking up and pasting a string of words or a couple of paragraphs. If you use, I think there's a way to use the same ideas over and over again and either put a new spin on them or have some original thought, or even just apply them in a different context that isn't self-plagiarism. But when you start seeing the exact same sentences over and over again, that's the definition of self-plagiarism in my view.
Sure, sure. And I guess for Jonathan, for you, for someone who works largely on publishing on the web, I mean, you must see this quite often, you know, where you know, a blogger or you know, a content producer online will just reuse the same content just in different contexts. So, you know, from your perspective, you know, how would you couch self-plagiarism?
Honestly, I would say that self-plagiarism, it functions very similarly to, you know, traditional plagiarism, in that there's a lot of gray area there. There's a lot of room in which you can sort of debate what is and is not plagiarism in that context. You know, when does it go from being like an homage to being a plagiarism, or when does it go from being just, you know, following the same path or being inspired by to going too far? You know, there's a whole lot of gray area there. But, you know, I would say that, you know, when you take work you had done previously and present it as new work, as something that's original, that's when you cross the line. Is that presentation, whether it's implicit or explicit, that presentation of it as a new work is where I consider it to be self-plagiarism.
Sure, sure. And you know, tangential to this is a question that's coming in from Kay Browning, who first off states that it would seem that once an author is paid for his or her work, he or she no longer owns it. If that's the case, is self-plagiarism more of an issue in academic circles where authors aren't necessarily paid?
Well, actually, once you're paid, sometimes you still retain the rights to your work. So, the first premise isn't exactly accurate. But even if you give up all of the rights to your work, I still think that there's a so you take your second premise that, okay, let's say you haven't been paid, so you haven't given up any rights to your work. I still think that it's dishonest if you suggest that, oh, hey, here's a whole new paper that I've written, but half of it appeared somewhere else. So there's a legality issue, and then there's also an honesty issue there. And I think that even if you're not legally in trouble for reusing work, you're certainly being dishonest in doing it unless you're letting people know.
Sure, Jonathan, you were nodding your head. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, that's one of the harder elements of this is you kind of have to separate the legal side, which is the copyright element, from the ethical side of it a little bit. Because as Kelly pointed out, you don't always, when you're paid for work, depending on work for hire, you may or may not have transferred the right. It depends on the exact situation. But if you do it for an employer, like Jonah Lehrer was an employee of all these publications, say he, was working for the New York Times, I think it was at one point, and he then goes to the New Yorker, another employer, and then reuses the same content, then there's a copyright issue between those two publications, a potential one at least, because they each, in this point in time, the New Yorker has potentially infringing material from the New York Times, even if it was by the same authors, because of who owns the rights. So that is an interesting issue with self-plagiarism. I don't think that's a likely one to come up in that context, just because of the nature of publications and the way they approach it. But it is an interesting element. But yeah, I think that's a separate question from the ethical side.
Sure, sure. And actually, Bob posed a question here, and Bob wants to know, is there an inherent expectation, I mean, given what you said, is there an inherent expectation that only original research contributes to the body of scholarly literature? Maybe, Rachel, you can pick that one up, since that's sort of your field.
I think it's difficult. It's sort of a sweeping question to say that, because I'm emailing an editor the other day, and he said, well, often research gets reused, and it gets added to and it gets enhanced either through extra data, through studies being extended, or through supplementary information being added. So although that's not necessarily original research, in the nature of the way that I guess science more than anything works, is that you're adding to the information that's already there, and you're re-examining it. So although the basic research might not be original, there's definitely a lot that can, there's definitely a lot more that can be added there. But I think it's just a case of, say, crediting the original research where that happens.
Sure, sure. Mohammed has a question that sort of touches on this as well. Mohammed wants to know, well, first off, Mohammed states an author might need to rewrite some of his work to form basis for new research. Is it legitimate to reuse this work as the author has copyrights? So in other words, is it legitimate to revisit or recite, reference previous work if that author has copyrights to that work?
I think it depends on the context, and I think it is the author's responsibility to get clarity on that context. So if I'm an author and I've published something over here, and now I have this editor over here, or this journal over here saying, hey, can you write on this? What I might say is, oh, I already wrote this over here. I have the rights to this. Do you just want to republish that? And that person might say, sure, and we'll pay you this much money for it, or sure, we're not going to pay you anything for it. But that editor might also say, no, we want something original. And, then as a writer, I'm like, well, then you have to pay me, right? Because I don't do original work for free generally unless there's something else to be gained. So then we talk about the terms of what I'm writing. How long is it? What are they expecting? Do they want it to advance the conversation? Do they want it to just rehash other things that I've done? So I really think that the authors don't operate in a vacuum in this setting. There's always an editor or a publisher on the other end that has a set of expectations. And then, in addition to that, there's this invisible audience out there and it's hard to figure out what the audience expects. But a lot of times you can work with the editor or the publisher and ask that person, does your audience expect original work? When I'm reading The New Yorker, it's an expensive magazine, and I absolutely expect the work to be original. As an audience member, that's what I expect. If I'm reading some professor's blog somewhere, I maybe don't have the same expectation. But as a writer, as an author, it's my obligation to make sure that I understand what the expectations are, both of the editor or the publisher, the person commissioning the work, and also of the audience.
Great, thank you, Kelly. Actually, your point on expectation as well as consideration of audience really does kind of take us to the next question in our PowerPoint deck here, which is namely, what has changed? I mean, given what we're thinking about with respect to expectations and audience and also pressures, pressures that come both from the standpoint of trying to succeed in careers, whether that be careers in journalism or in academia. What has changed in the past decade? I mean, really, we're talking the past decade with all the implications forthwith with respect to the internet and such. What has changed in the past decade that has contributed to the rise in self-plagiarism allegations? Jonathan, you want to give us your take on that?
Media and research has changed a great deal in the past 10 years or so. The internet has revolutionized everything, and we're still just sort of beginning to grasp it all. And one of the things is researchers, journalists, authors, whether they're doing books or essays or whatever, everyone is being asked to do more with less. I mean, bloggers are turning out, 10 articles a week, in most cases. Journalists are having to, instead of doing one article a day, many are being asked to do 3 or 4 posts a week. Researchers have to publish in order to keep their position. And so there's this drive to keep producing new content. And, when you put that pressure on there, most people handle it in an honest way. They find ways to deal with it and cope with it and thrive under it. But inevitably, some people sort of struggle with it, and they struggle with it both ethically and I think from a more practical standpoint as well, and begin to do things like self-plagiarize as a means of making ends meet, so to speak.
Sure. I mean, I definitely can see that from your point of view, Jonathan. I mean, just given the pressures of the web itself and publishing on the web.
Yeah.
Rachel, how does this impact you? I mean, what has changed for you in terms of publishing? What have you been seeing?
I think in terms of what we've been seeing, it's been linked into academic institutions, and the fact that there's also a pressure to publish being pushed onto academics, onto professors. So there is an expectation that a professor within a university or somebody looking for tenure will publish a certain amount per year. In the UK, for example, there's the REF, which is universities are being assessed on the amount of research they produce, and part of the way of measuring research output is by looking at how many publications, how many of their researchers are publishing year on year. So I think, like Jonathan says, there's an underlying pressure for people to be able to show their output and to have a really healthy output as well. And that's alongside busy jobs at the same time. So I really think that's where it's coming from. It's being driven by the academic institutions and the prestige of being able to publish and show that on your CV and on your applications.
Sure, and I think that sort of the downfall, the pitfalls, if you will, of this pressure and I point to you on this, Kelly, because you mentioned it earlier. I mean, we see Jonah Lehrer really as sort of, if you will, a low light or a highlight, either way you want to look at it, really with regards to this pressure. I mean, he really does seem to have succumbed to those pressures of his own notoriety, of his own fame.
Yeah. Well, the other thing that's changed though is that it's a lot easier to catch. So I mean, Jonah Lehrer is an example of how people found one little chink in his writing, one small little problem with it, and then the thing is it's not just like editors, it's like the whole entire internet ganged up on him and started looking at every single word he wrote, and they found lots and lots of problems. They didn't just find self-plagiarism, they found real plagiarism, and they found fabrication as well. And that's, so the fact that one, we can compare and contrast writing is so much easier now. And then the other fact is that we have this entire world out there with a lot of time on its hand, ready to take on any writer who seems to be too big for his britches.
Sure.
Yeah.
If I could play devil's advocate on that front, I think that, does this sort of speak to, how, if you want to really look at it from a cynical perspective, is this how people can be original? Can they be original by calling on or harping on the faults of others? I mean, in the face of the pressures of trying to be a fresh voice on the web, is this how folks can go about doing it? Can you create a name for yourself by being, the person that brings down or is the cause for the downfall of somebody who's done something that's really horrible?
Maybe. I mean, if you look at the writer who wrote the piece in Tablet that sort of busted Jonah Lehrer for creating the Bob Dylan quote, that he made a name for himself, and he sort of enhanced his reputation by doing that. But if you look at the other like 500 people who made accusations about Jonah Lehrer, nobody really knows who they are. So I don't know. I think it's a lot easier to criticize somebody else than it is to come up with your own work. So I think there are a lot of frustrated writers out there who are much more willing to turn their microscope on another writer's work rather than look at their own work and try and improve that.
Yeah, Jonathan, I'm going to point to you now. Yeah, no, I definitely appreciate that feedback. It makes a ton of sense. Jonathan, I'm going to point to you now. I mean, because you're somebody who blogs on a daily basis, you have a show that you do as well. I mean, talk to me about what the challenges are being original online, being just this constant generator of new and fresh content. I mean, what are the pressures that someone like you might face?
It's always tough to come up with new material, especially when you're like someone like me that operates in a relatively small niche. You're constantly going over a lot of the same territory, but you have to find new ways of doing it. There's always, and the thing about plagiarism is there's always these tangents you can come at it from. You can look at it from 100 different angles, and so there's, I've never felt really short on ideas or ways to express them with the site. Largely also because I have such a great readership that's always throwing things at me perpetually, so I'm always grateful for that. But yeah, I mean, there are times where there's been more than a few occasions where I've sat down, written an article, gotten about halfway through it, and then went to Google a question I had, and then it took me back to my own site where I had written the exact same article like 3 years ago, and it's like, screw it, doing something else. And then you got to go and you got to move on, and then or do a little post link to it or whatever. You got to do something else. I've had that happen at least a dozen times that I can recall off the top of my head, probably many more. But so there is a lot of pressure there. It is an insane pressure, and it's not just pressure to keep writing, but to keep writing high quality stuff over and over and over again, day in and day out. And it's that combination of needing to keep outputting and to keep making it high quality. It's very draining. It's very intimidating. And me, I kind of go with it. It's a subject I'm passionate about. I'm lucky, so I get to do something I love every day. But I can understand why a lot of people succumb to it. It's very easy to imagine.
Sure, sure. And turning to you, Rachel, I think, when we're talking about this in an academic context, particularly with research journals, I mean, the stakes are considerably higher. And we're not just talking about, the fact that somebody has pawned off or reproduced or replicated information that they produced in the past, but I mean, this does have broader implications because some of this research is used by people in the health field, where, there is a direct impact on patients, for example. So maybe you can talk to us about some of the challenges about being original or why it's important to be original in the academic publishing sphere.
It's a bit of a sweeping statement, but the top journals that you want to get published in, the Science, the Nature, the really top publications, they're always looking for new research, and the sort of slightly different subject studies and slightly very interesting ones. I think for the slightly sort of lower tier journals, for them it's enough to sort of publish good, sound science that again is maybe an extension on an earlier study. But for the researchers who want to get published in the top journals and the cutting edge ones, then you've got to be publishing new research because they're not interested in publishing, oh well this was found interesting in 1975 or that kind of thing. So I think that's where the originality is important in terms of medical publication, and obviously you do have the peer review process in place to really check for the accuracy of the original research as well.
Yeah, thank you for clarifying that, because we do sort of touch on other issues when we talk about academic publishing. It's not just about self-plagiarism, but it's also about, academic misconduct or research misconduct. So there are some other issues that we have to contend with there as well. I'm going to change the course of our conversation here. Let's move on to our next question here. So, I mean, given what we've seen with respect to the rise in self-plagiarism, what is being done to prevent it?
One of the things that the editors are doing these days is making explicit what used to be implicit. So the thing about Jonah Lehrer and a lot of other writers who've been busted doing this is they're not actually employees, they're contractors. So they don't actually come into the office to do their work. They work from their house, and they have contracts with a lot of different publications. Jonah Lehrer, when he was exposed, had a contract with both the New Yorker and Wired magazine. Now they're saying explicitly, we expect your work to be original. They're saying that verbally, and they're putting it in the written contracts. In addition to that, they're spending a lot more time looking at the other work that the writer has done. And when you are an employee, when you actually work for, when you get your full salary from one place, it's much harder, because you can't even do outside work without getting permission from your boss. So with employees, there's the policies are already there to prevent you from doing that. You can repurpose the work that you've already done, but you still have to get permission. And so there's this built-in system of checks and balances when you're an employee. The problem is in publishing for magazines and newspapers and websites, we're actually moving to a contract model. There are going to be fewer and fewer full-time writers at any given place, and many more contractors, because that's what the economy will support.
Sure, sure. And I guess, this does sort of speak to authors taking on the responsibility of ensuring that they're not self-plagiarizing. So Jonathan, what's some advice that you could provide folks who are looking to publish? What are some steps that they can do to ensure that they're not self-plagiarizing?
The first thing I always advise people to do is, if you have any doubts about something you're wanting to do, talk to your editor. Talk to the people who are above you. Ask them what they think you should do. But the main thing I always believe is you're not going to get in trouble for giving too much information, realistically, about where you're sourcing stuff from. If you're pulling it from your older material, pulling from something else, attributing it and giving that information and entrusting it to your reader, that is almost always a good thing to do. I mean, it doesn't matter if it's your own work or someone else's. Attributing, being straightforward and being honest is just the best approach, and it's tough to do sometimes, especially when you do write as much as a lot of authors, but it's important, and your readers and your editors alike will appreciate it.
Thank you, Jonathan. And, pointing to you, Rachel, with respect to self-plagiarism, we've gotten a couple of questions that have come through during the course of today's conversation about sort of what amount of the repurposing of content or reuse of content, about what amount constitutes self-plagiarism. Are there any kind of guidelines that you can share with our participants today about best practices around judging how much of a new work that they're going to submit for publishing consideration, how much of it can or should draw from previous works?
I'd probably go with what Jonathan's just said regarding this question, is that a lot of journals or a lot of publishers will have a policy on referencing, and some explicitly, a lot actually now explicitly mention self-plagiarism. So what you can do is you can just go to the instructions for authors for the journal and have a look, or look at the publisher plagiarism policy, and just see what they set out as their advice on it. again, what I'd say, with Jonathan as well, is if it's not clear from the instructions, then ask the editor. There should be a contact person at the journal whereby you can get in touch and say, look, I'm publishing this piece of work. This information is taken from another article, and just get their take on it as well. Because as you said, you can't be too clear as to how much you've taken. And I think as well, it's hard to dole out a specific percentage in that, it could be taken, the work that you're reproducing could be from different sources. It could be from a conference proceedings, whereby it could be quite a short piece of work. It could be from a book, it's that kind of information. So I think because publishing covers such a wide sphere of subject areas, get in contact with the publication that you're intending to submit to and just ask them. And that way you're clear before you even get to the point whereby somebody could suggest that you're trying to misattribute stuff.
Sure, thank you. And that it really is, it strikes me as a really good piece of advice. And there's an irony around that as well. So what you're saying, Rachel, just to kind of restate what you've mentioned is that, or to kind of hone in a little bit on your statement, it's really about communication. It's about connecting with your audience directly. In this case, your audience might be an editor or a contractor or a journal, to get more detailed guidelines on how and what way you should develop your content for publication or for consideration. And it's interesting, and I said ironic because it's precisely, what we're seeing, what I think we're seeing is precisely the breakdown of that communication. Yeah, really where there's a reluctance on the authors, or perhaps just a sense of not knowing what to do or how to proceed in terms of working with their content and publication. So any kind of advice from you, Jonathan, or you, Kelly, about what are some best practices for publishers, not for publishers, but for authors to take with respect to opening the door to that communication? First off, are editors open to hearing from authors, Kelly, or is there a
Yes.
invisible wall there?
No, editors would love to hear from authors, and they want to know what your process is for getting the work done. So I think in addition to that, having a process for writing, sometimes when I sit down and I look at writers and I look at how they're writing, I just think, oh my God, what a disaster. This person is so unorganized. They're not keeping track of where this thought comes from, or where this material comes from, or this idea. And so I think having a really good process for authors to organize their material, because one of the in some of the research that I've done on plagiarism, many authors who've been busted for regular old plagiarism say, gosh, it was a mistake. I picked up some of that material from someplace and I put it into my notes file, and then I thought I'd written it and I put it into my piece. I'm not sure I believe that when that happens, but that's what they say. Mm-hmm. Now, I think that if you can be organized in your writing process, if you can describe with confidence where your ideas come from and how you might have taken this idea that somebody else had, or this idea that you had 2 years ago, and now you're advancing it in another way, or you're adding something to it. I think if you can visualize your writing process in that sort of way, you're going to be a lot safer as a writer than if you are if you're just picking up chunks of text and organizing them in a notes file somewhere. When I work with really young writers sometimes, and one of the things that I tell them to do is to put all their material away and sit down and tell me what they're writing about. Tell me what their thesis is and what they're trying to assert. And one of the things that does for an author is it helps the author clarify in her own mind what she really knows and what she can assert on her own, what she's relying on somebody else for, and where she needs to do more work. So I think you can do that with your editor, you can do that with somebody else, but taking responsibility for your own writing process, however you do that, is really important.
Sure, and then responsibility is something that you harp on often, Jonathan. Any sorts of, I guess, tips or advice you can give to folks who are looking to publish? What's been your approach in terms of approaching a contractor or an editor to get work published?
I like a lot of what Kelly said about sort of explaining what you want to talk about. I always prepare kind of like an elevator pitch version of what you're wanting to talk about, what you're wanting to do. That 30-second, snappy in and out idea, I really like that, and I encourage people who talk to me about what they want to write about to do exactly that. And like she said, it helps clear it in your own mind, helps clear it to the editor, and that gets you to communicating and back and forth on it, and then you can start fleshing it out and building upon it. So that's a great first way to start. Definitely don't go throwing around your work into would-be editors' faces. That doesn't tend to get you very far, I find. They read enough, and if they want to hear your ideas, if they want to see more of what you're doing, that's it's pretty easy to get. But stand on your past work would be the other thing I would say. Get work out there, blog, do good work elsewhere. And that makes it easier to get the attention of an editor and build upon that as well.
Sure, sure. I think at this point in time, let's turn to some of the questions that have been coming in. I noticed there was one question that came in from Christoph. Christoph, I think this question is something for you, Rachel. Christoph asks, is it legitimate to publish journal publications and reuse the information for the PhD thesis with a reference to the publication?
From a publishing perspective, that's absolutely fine. And I think the key part of that is where you're saying with reference to the publication. You need to make it clear where you're using that from. And actually, and this touches on the copyright aspect that we were talking about earlier, a lot of publishers, although it sometimes seems that their copyright licenses can be quite rigid, if you look in the information of them, a lot will say, look, it's absolutely fine to reproduce that material within say, a PhD thesis or something which isn't for commercial use, and some even permit it for commercial use as well. So I think you can look at the publisher copyright policies, and if you're referencing the work, that for the majority of cases that would be absolutely fine.
Sure, sure, and also it does sort of speak to the use of that content in other contexts, specifically conferences or uploading working papers to social media sites for researchers and such. It sounds like publishers will look favorably on that, provided that there's some transparency on the author's part about the use of that content. Is that correct, Rachel?
Yeah, I really think so, because at the end of the day, they're somebody reading that thesis or reading that research is going to be pointed back to the publisher article where they can go to in order to read more, to find out more information. So it's absolutely, it's a really key part of the way that research works, is for, if something's referenced somewhere, to be able to link it to the original source and for somebody to go and be able to read that if they're interested in learning more. So it's not something that publishers are prohibitive about. It's when there's the option for commercial reuse that sometimes it gets a little bit trickier.
Sure, sure. Now, given what you've shared with us, Rachel, it may kind of turn some of our participants, it may change their minds. They may go back and say, you know what, I did something in the past that could be considered self-plagiarism. And now I recognize that maybe the audience to whom I sent that article or that content is going to look favorably on me, or is not going to consider it as heinous a crime, if you will, as I initially thought it might be. If that's the case, if someone has a change of heart, what should they do? Let's say if someone says, you know what, I realized I self-plagiarized, and they want to go back and make amends for that. What are some guidelines that you folks might be able to provide them? And this is out to any of our panelists to respond to.
If it's online,
yeah,
you can always go and add a note.
Yeah, I was about to say.
That says portions of this work originally appeared here, and that's actually a really good way if it's online. Now, if it's in a printed publication, I think you're in a more difficult situation. You also are less likely that somebody's going to stumble across it in a printed publication. So I think you're probably less likely to get caught. But anyway, that's my one suggestion.
Great. And Jonathan, you were agreeing with Kelly there. Do you want to expand on that a bit?
Yeah, well, I mean, it's kind of a strange question because I don't think I've actually heard of it happening. So I'm trying to It's kind of a hypothetical, but yeah, I agree. On the internet, nothing is fixed in stone. It's one of the beautiful things about it. Go back, add your footnote, or even update it. I mean, articles on the internet are updated all the time, so it's not it's untrue. It's very trivial to go in and do that. As far as print, you can always. I mean, newspapers do have a corrections policy, but that always feels inadequate in these situations in a strange way. The corrections usually kind of get buried and lost, so I'm not sure how I feel about that. But I mean, yeah, when you're dealing with something that's fixed, you're dealing with something much more difficult. And I guess you could also request, like in the case of research, you could request a retraction. That happens fairly frequently. But once again, depending upon the nature of the self-plagiarism, that might be a fairly extreme approach. It might be that the amount reused doesn't warrant a full retraction, and I'm not sure how to deal with that. It's a very tough scenario.
Sure, sure. The question came through here from Mark, and I think this was assigned to you, Kelly. Is it self-plagiarism if there are some common data in a full paper and letter and conference paper?
You know, plagiarism is specifically using the same words over and over again. So you can have a lot of work based off of common data. And as long as the words themselves are original and unique, it's not self-plagiarism.
Here's a somewhat challenging one, and this one's for you, Rachel. It's from Jeff. So Jeff says that he's upset because an author, they asked to rewrite 2 self-plagiarized manuscripts in a manuscript. That author responded by withdrawing that manuscript. Any suggestions on how Jeff and his cohorts might address that situation? So again, they found instances of self-plagiarism in a manuscript they received. They asked the author to make changes. The author subsequently, withdrew the paper from consideration. What are some next steps for Jeff and his folks?
It is tricky, and it is one that I've seen happen quite a lot through in journal publishing. What a lot of journals use use authenticate through cross-check. They'll check a paper whenever it gets submitted to the journal, and then, as you said, that's when it might show instances of self-plagiarism. And at that point, the policy is exactly what Jeff's just done: is to send it back to the author and say, we've noticed this. We need you to reference more thoroughly. We need you, and as you said, then the author really does have, 2 choices. They can either do what the editor suggests and correct the work, or, as you said, they can withdraw their manuscript. It's difficult to know what to do next, because, as you said, what they could potentially be doing is they could just be withdrawing their manuscript in order to go to a different publication and submit there and hope that it isn't spotted. So that might be what's happening there. The authors are allowed to withdraw their work, but it's difficult. I think it's something that you can watch out for those authors in future if they submit to your work. But I agree, it is a difficult one to handle. In terms of guidelines on plagiarism and on self-plagiarism as well, actually, because there's been quite a lot of questions coming in. There's an organisation called COPE that do sort of flow charts with actions and follow-up actions on what to do in these cases. So I think those are a really useful resource.
Thank you, Rachel. And kind of on that note, taking this a little far field, Carol had a question. I mean, given the rise that we've seen in self-plagiarism and plagiarism in general, how are organizations handling this? I mean, we're talking about, if we're dealing with an academic journal, we're dealing with thousands of manuscripts. If you're an editor in a newsroom, you're dealing with, or if you've hired out contractors to develop content, you're dealing with a lot of content. What is I guess the challenge look like from your side, whether that's your side, in terms of journalism, Kelly, or for you, Rachel, from the academic publishing side? How do you address all of these manuscripts that come in, all this content comes in? How do you manage that?
Well, this is sort of related to what Rachel was saying, and I'd love to hear her take on this. You know, we don't operate in a vacuum. You know, if I'm the editor of a journal that deals with topic A, there are maybe 5 other journals that deal with topic A, and I know all of those editors, right? Because we show up at the same conferences, and I have their emails. And so one of the things that I'm wondering, Rachel, is would you, if you were an editor of a journal and somebody withdrew something because you raised an ethical challenge to it, would you let other people that you know, would you make them aware that this particular writer had submitted something, you raised an ethical challenge, and that person withdrew?
It's kind of double-edged because, as you said, if you're working with a group of people in a similar field, then what you're probably going to want to do, and what I know people do is, as you said, is to, you know, you see those people at conferences, they're your colleagues, and you let them know, and you could flag up to say, oh, I got this paper from these people. You might just want to be aware. I guess again the you know, the ethical side of that is that it might be a mistake on behalf of the researchers. They might not have been clear as to, you know, they might not have been that clear as to why they wanted to withdraw their paper. So it's tricky to know whether to sort of spread the word about what could potentially be a, you know, an author who's, you know, what could be author misconduct.
You know, I think it's delicate. I don't think you want to call up other people in the business and tarnish somebody's reputation. But I also think that as a professional courtesy, I think there's a way of doing it without making an accusation and just saying, you know, these were the challenges that I raised, and if this person submits a paper to you, you might want to look for those same ethical issues.
I mean,
So I do think that we think of the world, especially the internet, as this like vast world where nobody knows each other. But in fact, you know, we're all connected closer than we ever have been.
Okay, well that concludes our session today. I'd like to thank our panelists for their terrific insights, and thanks to all of you for attending. We will be addressing many of the submitted questions that we weren't able to answer today on authenticate.com. You'll also be able to view a recording of today's event at that site. Please also look for an email from us in the coming weeks to let you know when that recording will be available. At the bottom of the last slide here, we have a link to a paper called The Ethics of Self-Plagiarism. Please go ahead and take a look at that paper. It's available for you to download. And please feel free to email us any of your thoughts or questions about today's topic or session. Thanks again, and we look forward to seeing you next time.